The Rose of Greenwood. Chapter 7. Among the Ashes. 3 days later, Rose finally opened her diary again. June 4, 1921. Today, we learned what remains when everything else is taken away. Rose Washington had not slept properly since fleeing Greenwood. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw orange flames against a dark sky, heard the distant crack of gunfire, felt again the terrible urgency of leaving everything behind. But this morning, as she sat on the front porch of the Hutchinson farm watching the sun rise over the peaceful countryside, she felt something she hadn't experienced in days: a moment of stillness. The refugees from Greenwood had settled into a routine of sorts over the past 3 days. Mrs. Hutchinson and her neighbors had been incredibly generous, providing food and shelter and kindness to people they barely knew. But Rose could see the strain in everyone's faces, the uncertainty of not knowing what came next, the grief of losses both confirmed and feared, the desperate hope that somehow things would return to normal. This morning, that hope received its first crushing blow. Dr. Jackson returned from his reconnaissance trip to Tulsa just after breakfast, his face carrying news that no one wanted to hear but everyone needed to know. "It's gone," he said simply, addressing the gathering of families on the Hutchinson porch. "All of it. Every building, every business, every home. They burned it all." The silence that followed his words was profound and terrible. Rose watched as the faces around her processed this information, some nodding as if they had expected it, others staring in disbelief, a few beginning to weep quietly. "The library?" Rose heard herself ask, though she already knew the answer. "Gone. Nothing left but the foundation stones." Rose felt something cold settle in her chest. She had known, intellectually, that the library was likely destroyed. But hearing it confirmed made the loss feel real in a way it hadn't before. All those books, all those carefully maintained records, all those dreams and possibilities, reduced to ash and memory. "What about the people?" asked Mrs. Patterson. "The ones who didn't get out?" Dr. Jackson's expression grew even more grim. "The official reports are incomplete. The authorities are claiming only a handful of deaths, but..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "There are many people unaccounted for. Many families separated, and the conditions for those who remained." He shook his head. "It's not good." Over the next hour, Dr. Jackson shared what he had learned during his careful survey of what had once been Greenwood. The destruction was complete and systematic. Not a single building had been spared. Families who had hidden in their homes during the violence had been rounded up and taken to internment camps around the city. Personal belongings had been looted before the buildings were burned. Even the churches, the sacred spaces where the community had gathered for worship and fellowship, had been reduced to rubble. But perhaps most devastating of all was the realization that this destruction had not been the work of an uncontrolled mob, but of an organized campaign with official sanction. Fire trucks had been present, but they had protected white-owned buildings while letting black-owned properties burn. Police had participated in the looting. The National Guard, when it finally arrived, had arrested black victims rather than white perpetrators. "They didn't just want to destroy our property," Dr. Jackson said quietly. "They wanted to destroy the very idea that we could build something like Greenwood. They wanted to make sure it could never happen again." Rose felt anger surge through her, clean, pure anger that cut through the grief and confusion of the past 3 days. This had not been about Dick Rowland, or about a misunderstanding in an elevator, or even about racial tensions. This had been about the systematic destruction of black prosperity, black dignity, black hope. "So what do we do now?" asked Mr. Williams, his voice heavy with exhaustion. The question hung in the air like smoke. What did they do now? Where did they go? How did they rebuild not just their homes and businesses, but their faith in the possibility of building something beautiful in a world that seemed determined to destroy it? It was Clara who spoke first, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "We survive," she said simply. "We take care of each other. We remember what we've lost, but we don't let it destroy what we still have." "Which is what, exactly?" Mr. Patterson asked bitterly. "They took everything. They took our buildings," Clara replied. "They took our businesses. But they didn't take our knowledge. They didn't take our skills. They didn't take our determination to create something better for our children." Rose looked at her mother with new respect. Clara had always been the steady one in their family, the one who provided emotional stability while Dr. Washington provided intellectual leadership. But now Rose could see the core of steel that had always been there, the strength that came from generations of women who had survived the unsurvivable. "Mom is right," Rose found herself saying. "They burned the library, but they didn't burn what we learned from the books. They destroyed our school, but they didn't destroy our education. They took our homes, but they didn't take our ability to build new ones." Dr. Jackson nodded slowly. "There's something else," he said. "I spoke with some folks in town, white folks who weren't part of what happened. They're ashamed. Some of them want to help with rebuilding." "Help how?" Mrs. Patterson asked skeptically. "Donations, land, political support for getting some kind of aid from the state or federal government." Rose felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. If there were white citizens willing to stand up for justice, willing to help repair the damage that had been done, then perhaps not all was lost. But even as she entertained that hope, she remembered her father's words about rights on paper versus rights in practice. Good intentions from individual white citizens were one thing. Systematic change was another. "Has anyone heard anything about?" Rose paused, gathering her courage. "About Papa? About any of the men who went to the courthouse that night?" The silence that followed her question was answer enough. Dr. Jackson looked away, unable to meet her eyes. "Rose," he said finally, "there were casualties among the men who went downtown that night. But I don't have a complete list yet. And with people scattered across 3 counties, it may be weeks before we know for certain who." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Rose understood. Her father might be dead. He might be in hiding. He might be in one of the internment camps, arrested for the crime of trying to protect an innocent man. Without communication, without any way to search safely, there was no way to know. The not knowing was almost worse than certainty would have been. That afternoon, Rose found herself walking alone through the fields surrounding the Hutchinson farm, trying to process everything she had learned. The countryside was beautiful, rolling hills covered with early summer grass, wildflowers blooming in casual abundance, the kind of peaceful landscape that seemed to mock the human capacity for destruction. She thought about her father, wherever he was. She thought about Grace Mitchell and her other students, scattered like seeds on the wind. She thought about the books that had been burned, the stories that had been lost, the dreams that had been interrupted. But most of all, she thought about what came next. When she returned to the farmhouse as evening was approaching, she found a small group gathered around Clara, who was reading aloud from great-grandmother Sarah's book of poetry. The voices of Phyllis Wheatley seemed to speak directly to their situation. "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Even in slavery," Clara said softly, closing the book, "our ancestors found ways to create beauty, to express hope, to maintain their dignity. If they could do that under those circumstances, surely we can find a way forward from this." Rose realized that her mother was right. The destruction of Greenwood was not the first catastrophe their people had faced, and it would not be the last. But their ancestors had survived slavery, had survived Reconstruction, had survived countless acts of violence and oppression. And from each survival, they had built something new. That evening, as the refugees gathered for another communal meal, Rose made a decision. She approached Dr. Jackson, who was sitting alone on the porch, staring out at the darkening countryside. "Dr. Jackson," she said, "I want to go back." He looked at her with surprise. "Back where, child?" "To Tulsa. To see what's left. To find out about Papa and the others. To start figuring out what we do next." "Rose, it's not safe. The authorities are still rounding up colored folks, putting them in camps. You could be arrested, or worse. Then I'll be careful. But I can't stay here not knowing. And more than that." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "Someone needs to start the work of remembering. Someone needs to document what happened, who was lost, what was destroyed. Someone needs to make sure the real story gets told." Dr. Jackson studied her face in the fading light. You're talking about dangerous work, Rose. The kind of work that could get you killed. Papa always said that education was freedom. Well, truth is education. And right now, the truth about what happened in Greenwood is in danger of being buried along with everything else." The older man was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of admiration. "You sound like your father." "I hope so." "All right, but not alone. I'll come with you. And we'll be very, very careful." 2 days later, Rose found herself riding in Dr. Jackson's automobile toward the ruins of her former life. As they approached Tulsa, she could smell the destruction before she could see it, the acrid scent of burned wood and melted metal, the lingering odor of smoke that seemed to hang in the air like a funeral shroud. When they reached the area that had once been Greenwood, Rose felt her breath catch in her throat. Dr. Jackson had prepared her for total destruction, but seeing it was different from hearing about it. Where thriving businesses had stood just a week ago, there were only foundations and charred debris. Where families had lived and loved and raised their children, there were only vacant lots marked by the ghostly outlines of former homes. The devastation was complete, systematic, and terrifying in its thoroughness. But even more disturbing than the physical destruction was the presence of white sightseers, people who had come to gawk at the ruins as if they were visiting a tourist attraction. Some were taking photographs, posing next to the wreckage as if it were a monument to their victory rather than a graveyard of dreams. Rose felt sick. "Come on," Dr. Jackson said quietly. "Let's see what we can learn." They spent the next several hours carefully moving through the ruins, talking to the few black residents who had been allowed to return during daylight hours to search for salvageable belongings. The stories they heard painted a picture of systematic cruelty that went far beyond simple destruction. Families had been forced to watch their homes burn. Personal belongings, photographs, family heirlooms, children's toys, had been stolen or destroyed with deliberate malice. Even the dead had been treated without dignity, their bodies dumped in mass graves or thrown into the river. But Rose also heard stories of courage and survival. Families who had hidden in their root cellars while their houses burned above them. Children who had been protected by neighbors, even at great personal risk. People who had lost everything but retained their determination to rebuild. As the day wore on, Rose began to compile a mental list of what needed to be done. Families needed to be reunited. The missing needed to be accounted for. Stories needed to be preserved. And somehow, someway, the work of rebuilding needed to begin. It was while talking to Mrs. Cooper, one of her former literacy students, that Rose learned something that gave her the first real hope she had felt since the destruction began. "Miss Rose," the elderly woman said, pulling her aside. "I got something to show you." She led Rose to a partially burned foundation that Rose recognized as the remains of the library. There, hidden under a pile of rubble, Mrs. Cooper had discovered something remarkable. A metal box that had somehow survived the flames. "Found it this morning," Mrs. Cooper said. "Thought you might want to see what's inside." With trembling hands, Rose opened the box. Inside, protected by the metal casing, were some of the library's records, including the attendance sheets from her evening literacy classes and several of the simple readers they had used for instruction. It wasn't much. Most of the library's collection was gone forever. But seeing those few surviving documents felt like discovering buried treasure. Here was proof that her students had existed, that their struggles and triumphs had mattered, that their dreams had been real. "Mrs. Cooper," Rose said, looking up at the elderly woman who had struggled so hard to learn to write her own name, "how are you managing?" "Where are you staying?" "With my sister across town, in the white section. She's got a job as a domestic, so they're letting me stay as long as I don't cause trouble." Mrs. Cooper's voice carried a bitterness that Rose had never heard from her before. "But Miss Rose, I want you to know something. What you taught me, what I learned in those classes, they can't take that away. I can still read, I can still write, and I'm going to teach my grandchildren, so they'll know what we lost and why we can't let it happen again." As they prepared to leave Tulsa that evening, Rose felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what lay ahead. The physical destruction was bad enough, but the deeper damage, the trauma, the displaced families, the shattered faith in justice and safety. That would take much longer to heal. That night, back at the Hutchinson farm, Rose finally felt ready to write in her diary again. The words came slowly at first, then faster as she realized what she needed to say. June 6, 1921. Today I saw what hatred can accomplish when it is organized, systematic, and given official sanction. I saw the complete destruction of everything my community built over 30 years of hard work and dreams. But I also saw something else. I saw Mrs. Cooper, who lost her home and most of her possessions, teaching her grandson to write his name in the dirt with a stick. I saw Mr. Patterson sharing his meager lunch with a family that had lost even more than he had. I saw people who had every reason to despair, choosing instead to care for each other. They burned our buildings, but they could not burn our knowledge. They destroyed our businesses, but they could not destroy our skills. They scattered our community, but they could not break the bonds between us. I still don't know what happened to Papa. The not knowing is a weight I carry with every breath. But I do know this. The work he started, the principles he lived by, the dreams he helped nurture, those survive. Those will always survive. Tomorrow, I will begin the work of rebuilding. Not buildings, not yet, but something more important. I will begin rebuilding hope. I will start gathering the scattered stories of our community, preserving the memories that they tried to erase, planning for a future that honors both what we lost and what we still possess. The dreams will continue, even in exile, even in loss, even in the face of those who would destroy them. As they always have, as they always will. As Rose closed her diary, she looked around the crowded farmhouse where so many displaced families were trying to make sense of their new reality. Children were doing homework by lamplight, using slates and books donated by sympathetic neighbors. Adults were sharing skills and resources, creating informal networks of support and survival. Elderly voices were telling stories, passing on the history and wisdom that no fire could destroy. It wasn't Greenwood. It might never be Greenwood again. But it was community. It was resilience. It was the proof that some things cannot be destroyed, no matter how systematically hatred tries to erase them. And that, Rose realized, was enough to begin again.